Hello, hello, and welcome to Coup, using poetry to confront the history of mental health treatment. My name is Stephen T. Liccardi. I am an autistic social worker, spoken word poet, and performance activist. I am here on Monacan and Tutelo occupied lands in the Blue Ridge Mountains of southwestern Virginia. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the facts about mental health treatment in the United States, some of the hidden history, as well as the ways in which I use poetry to process and make sense of those facts. This first slide depicts the cover of my book, A Billion Burning Dreams, which traces my own mental health journey from patient to professional. And I'll be sharing a poem or two from this collection a little bit later on. This is a book that was written in 1911 by a German psychologist by the name of Eugene Bleuler. He was studying something at the time that was called dementia precox, or precocious madness, which is kind of this catch-all phrase that collapsed a lot of diagnoses into it. But he was the first one to separate it into what he called the schizophrenias, or the schisms with reality, the most severe form of which he called autism. Now, our current diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is much different than his original conception and has now become quite divorced from schizophrenia, which is another diagnosis altogether. But when I first heard about this, I was working in Jamaica, Queens, where there is a counseling center that still bears Bleuler's name. That's when I first became aware of this. And as an individual who was diagnosed on the autism spectrum as a child, it really started me on this journey of thinking about some of the history that I wasn't taught and I wasn't aware of, and started me educating myself on the truths of how mental health treatment is manifested here in the United States. I currently live in southwestern Virginia now, and this picture is of the Central State Hospital, which was originally known as the Central Lunatic Asylum for Colored Insane. It was the first mental health treatment facility designed specifically to treat African Americans. It started as a Confederate war hospital in Richmond called Howard's Grove before it was converted to treat African American folks, and then during the Reconstruction era was transferred to a former plantation site, actually, in Petersburg, Virginia, to treat formerly enslaved folks who had been emancipated. But so what makes this hospital so unique is that it has the most complete record of any hospital to treat African Americans in the world, and those documents are now being housed and have recently been digitized by the University of Austin. And when we look at those documents, what we're able to see is a very clear line of the continuation of racism from pre-Civil War in the United States till well afterwards. Looking at those documents where we see formerly enslaved folks that were coming into the hospital with psychosis symptoms, and the cause of their psychosis, as written in their documents, in their files, was freedom. Freedom was seen as the reason for why these formerly enslaved folks had lost their minds. And it is completely in line with the legacy of drapetomania, which was another false diagnosis which was used to explain why enslaved people would flee. And further still, their health was determined based on their willingness to work for free. So if you were doing well, it was based on whether or not you were willing to give up your labor. And again, we see this as a continuation of chattel slavery in the United States. This next slide is taken from that archive. The description, which reads, "Group of insane patients road building." I'd like to think of myself as an insane patient who's road building. What's important, I think, about this documentation is that it shows that the legacy of racism, which permeates, in my opinion, all social structures in the United States, mental health treatment was not immune from that, and indeed was carried up to, I believe, in the modern day. And so this is an incredibly important piece of data and documentation, which you can find largely for free online. Another facility that I wanted to discuss is the Canton Asylum for Insane Indians. This is out in South Dakota, and this was a mental health facility that was a lie. Calling it a hospital was a misnomer. This was a federal facility for the punishment of indigenous peoples. People from on different reservation lands all across the country who had been involved with policing or the criminal justice system would be sent and siloed to this facility out in South Dakota, often shipped from very far distances away, separate from their ancestral lands, separate from their cultures. Indeed, many folks that were housed here couldn't communicate because they did not have a shared language. But for the town of Canton, it was a huge piece of their economy. This was during the Depression era, during the Dust Bowl. And so they actually used to charge admission for tourists to come in and survey the facility. But for the residents who were there, residents, quote unquote, they were being subjected to profound torture, profound dehumanization, and at least one case of documented sexual assault that resulted in the birth of a child. So this was a retrospective study that was done in the 1980s that provides some pretty gruesome details about the despicable, disgusting acts taking place at Canton at its peak. I'm currently in the process of doing an erasure project on this document to excavate, again, some meaning from this dark time in history and the ways in which that legacy is preserved in the modern day. The paper Being Sane in Insane Places by D.L. Rosenhan has been incredibly influential on my career. It was first published in Science magazine in 1973, and I first heard about it while studying an abnormal psych course at a local community college about 10 years ago now. Rosenhan designed this experiment to see how good psychiatrists and psychologists are at distinguishing the sane from the insane. His study design was he had a bunch of graduate students and he gave them a bunch of fake symptoms and told them to go to the local hospital to see if they could be admitted, even with these fake symptoms. One of those hospitals was St. Elizabeth's, which is where 121 of the remaining indigenous peoples from Canton were sent after the hospital was shut down. Well, lo and behold, every single one of these grad students were accepted. And not only were they accepted into the hospital, but they found it incredibly difficult to leave. Something of note here is that this paper, this design, is really part of a larger legacy in investigative journalism. This book, 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly, had a similar idea where she had got herself forcibly admitted to a mental hospital in New York. I believe it was Blackwell Hospital on Roosevelt Island. And she found it incredibly difficult to get out. And what I think was extremely brave of her was that the history of mental health treatment, again, disproportionately impacts women. There's a broad history of, this trope of husbands who get fed up with their wives, just send them to a mental hospital. That actually happened. And I think it's really important to note that Rosenhan was not making up this idea in a vacuum. But his graduate students got into this hospital. Lo and behold, they found it hard to get out. They could only get out if the psychologist and the psychiatrist decided, based on these fake symptoms, that they were in remission. So not only were they deemed insane, when in fact they were not, but they had this label that they could no longer get away from. And further still, perhaps last and I think most hauntingly, is that some of the students who went into the hospital actually started to believe, because of the total institution of the hospital, that they themselves were in fact insane. And so this has really kind of got me thinking about what is the relationship between sanity and insanity. And so I've gone back to this paper and I've done an erasure project. Erasure or blackout poetry is where you take a pre-existing text and you slash out pieces of the text to excavate meaning and poems from the text. And so this is one example of these poems. Commonly pejorative social stigmas see the sane, insane reversed. Another example is actually on this pin here, and it just simply says insanity is normal. I think erasure and blackout are incredibly powerful tools of digesting research data and materials. And so I really encourage you, whether you're a journalist or a scientist or a social worker or wherever you fall in the social strata as far as processing information, to use this technique. It is a powerful, intimate, beautiful technique of making sense of pre-existing texts. Now, to jump back to Bleuler, Bleuler was also a devout eugenicist. He believed that mentally ill folks should not be allowed to procreate. He was one of the first people to advocate for deinstitutionalizations, where these folks should not be siloed in institutions, but he just thought they shouldn't be allowed to have children. So this picture here is from the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island, New York, which is where I grew up in Suffolk County. That's where I was raised. And the history of eugenics is all across the history of mental health treatment. Here in Virginia, we are in arguably the eugenics social policy capital of the United States. This here is a sterilization form from 1924. It was that year that the state passed the Virginia Sterilization Act, which gave the Commonwealth the right to sterilize people against their will in state-run institutions. It was also the same year that Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, which prevented mixed-race couples from marrying. And it was really the start of this wave of legislation that would bake eugenics into our federal laws. In fact, there was a 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, where this law was challenged, and the highest court in the land upheld that law and gave the state the absolute right to sterilize people against their will. Now, that ruling has never been overturned. There's been apologies and dispensations, but that ruling is still on the books and still has the potential to justify unjust treatment of human beings here in the United States. So this image was taken at the Danvers State Hospital Cemetery, which is a few minutes outside of Salem, Massachusetts. The hospital itself has been converted into luxury condos, but the cemetery is still there, out in the backwoods in a pretty isolated area. So I visited this space a few years ago, and it started me on this new path to thinking about these remaining state hospital cemeteries across the United States. So this picture here was taken at Willard State Hospital Cemetery in upstate New York. Willard is perhaps most famous for the 900 suitcases which were found in the attic just before the hospital was poised to be demolished. Each one of these steel markers was wrought by the patients of the former hospital and is the only indication of where these folks are buried. Many of these hospitals have no way of knowing the names of these folks. There are only numbers and marking each grave. Indeed, there are 450,000 people buried in such state hospital cemeteries across New York State alone. And in recent years, I've taken it upon myself to document these spaces using photography and film and performance art and poetry. Because for me, these spaces are sacred and are demanding of our respect. So most recently, I had the opportunity to stay at the Black Inn in Stanton, which is the converted former site of Western State Hospital in Virginia. And this here is the cemetery that is right on the other side of that boutique hotel. And I found it quite ironic that a hotel would occupy the space where folks were kept against their will only a few decades before. And so this is the most recent effort to document these spaces, and I hope to combine them into a performance art piece in the very near future. As a mental health clinician, I believe that these spaces must be revered. I see each of these individuals who are, for all intents and purposes, nameless, as martyrs. When I look at the DSM-5, I see only a collection of incomplete stories. I think about all the people that we had to go through, had to erase in order to come up with these arbitrary diagnoses. I think we owe it to these folks to ensure that the systems that place them in these places are dismantled. These racist, dehumanizing systems are dismantled, and I have taken it upon myself to use poetry in order to confront and undo that work. Again, this is the cover of my most recent collection of poems, A Billion Burning Dreams, and I wanted to end on the piece entitled, If I Looked Like What I've Been Through. We've all been through things. We've all perpetrated things. We've all been survivors of things. I often think if we all wore the things that we've been through on the outside, how easy it would be to empathize, to understand, to have compassion. So I invite you to think about what you yourself may have gone through. And if in another time and place, you yourself may have been subjected to some of the history that we have talked about here today. So this is If I Looked Like What I've Been Through. If I looked like what I've been through, I'd have the face of a woman and a man contorted into a kind of in-between, feminine, masculine, with eyes that pierce and lips that tempt, with a jaw of glass that slices like obsidian and a brow that collects beads of sweat where ideas fall to their deaths. If I looked like what I've been through, I'd have a heart where my brain is supposed to be. I'd have a brain where my heart is supposed to be, and they'd constantly be switching, thinking, feeling, fighting for what is right, neither able to decide who is winning. If I looked like what I've been through, I'd be dressed in a three-piece straitjacket with cufflinks, dressed to the nines in a canvas tux with the images that cloud my mind painted on. It's a metaphor for my artistic fervor, my former affliction transformed into a brilliance no less insane. If I looked like what I've been through, my blood type would be ink, and you would see it coursing in sentences and verses just beneath my skin. If I looked like what I've been through, my skin wouldn't be able to tell you what race I am, but you would still judge me. I'd have the misplaced morality of a Christian, the pantheon of a Hindu, the hope of an atheist, and the history of a Jew. If I looked like half as much as I've been through, I'd only be half a person, an incomplete masterwork, a magnum opus loaded only with dummy bullets. I wouldn't have half the passion that bleeds like beads of sweat from my gaping pores and rivulets of syntax that I dab with loose-leaf paper to preserve what I've been through. If I looked like what I've been through, you wouldn't even see me. You'd only see the things that make me me, but they are not me. You see, I am so much more than just what I have been through. I am infinitely stronger. You are infinitely stronger, and I am so thankful to be given the opportunity to present my work here today at APBEN. Thank you so much. This is my contact information. Please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts and use any of the things here as part of this presentation in your own work.